Welcome to the COVIDENCE UK webinar for May 2021. My name's Adrian Martineau. I'm the Chief Investigator based at Queen Mary, University of London. It seems hard to believe that it's a year now since COVIDENCE launched on the 1st of May 2020. But now that year has passed, I think it's a good moment to take stock and see, first of all, what we've achieved together in the first year of the project, to discuss some of our very latest findings with you, to outline our plans moving forward, and to introduce to you our slightly more streamlined monthly questionnaire. So to summarise the progress in the last year, we've had a total now of 19,094 sign-ups to the study. You have completed a total of no fewer than 132,703 monthly questionnaires. That's 87.1% of those sent out. We've done a total of 12,364 antibody tests and raised over £700,000 to support the research effort. And I'm very grateful not just to you for all your work in doing these questionnaires and running those antibody tests, but also to our funders, Bart's Charity, Fisher Family Trust, Dango Education, Farm and Nord, DSM, AIM Foundation, Synergy and Cytoplan. So what have we actually found, and what's it all been for? Well, first of all, I can point to some novel risk factors which we've identified. To allude to some of the new data coming out of the antibody study, we're showing that vaping is associated with a 47% increased risk in contracting SARS-CoV-2 infection. And we've also identified some surprising, perhaps protective factors. You'll remember from a previous webinar our finding that allergic disease, including eczema and allergic rhinitis or hay fever, was protective against SARS-CoV-2 infection, possibly associated with the reduced expression of ACE2, which is the receptor for the virus on the cells which line the lung. We've also provided some new insights into recognised risk factors. Again, latest results from our serology study show that obesity or being overweight is not just associated with an increased risk of severe disease, but it's also associated with increased susceptibility to infection in the first place. And that will give us some clues to now investigate the pathogenesis and the effects of being overweight on the immune response, which doesn't just affect severity, as I say, but also susceptibility. Another key finding that we've shown some light on is the ethnic disparity in risk of disease, with people, particularly of South Asian and Black African heritage, being at increased risk of severe COVID-19. This is widely being attributed to socioeconomic factors, and this is something that we've looked at in considerable detail. And so far, we've not been able to explain the difference by any socioeconomic factor investigated. And this can provide leads to scientists who are working to understand why there is an ethnic difference in disease risk and disease severity. I think a third main thing that we've also shown is that factors for severe disease are not the same as factors that affect susceptibility to disease. And this is again a point that you'll remember perhaps from our last webinar, where I highlighted that the risks for developing COVID-19, here shown on the left of the screen, with the green one showing decreased risk and the red one showing increased risk, only partially overlap with those risks for severe COVID-19. In other words, what we've shown is quite reassuring, I think, in a way, in that we've shown that older age or having underlying conditions like ischemic heart disease, diabetes or hypertension, although they may increase severity of disease if you're unlucky enough to get SARS-CoV-2 infection, they don't actually increase susceptibility to the infection per se. But this is not really the time to rest on our laurels, because although COVID-19 in the UK is now decreasing or stable, largely as a result of the vaccination programme, I think it would be fair to say that it's down but not out. We know that there are new variants of concern, in particular the so-called Indian variant, which is circulating at increased rate at the moment. We know that the vaccine rollout has been good but is still incomplete. We know that vaccine efficacy is high, but it's less than 100%. We know that people who've had COVID, many of them are having prolonged symptoms. And society is also dealing not just with the impacts of the infection itself, but also with the impacts of lockdown measures taken to control the pandemic. And so as we move into the second year of COVIDENCE, the emphasis on what we're investigating will start to shift in tune with the change in the shape of the pandemic. So you'll know that early on in the pandemic, we've been very much focusing on risk factors. I think as the months move on, we're going to start focusing a little bit more on looking at the impacts of the pandemic, both on terms of our physical health, on terms of mental health, and also in terms of the impacts that the change in society had on people's well-being. Another major thing we want to evaluate is the effect of COVID-19 vaccination, and some 3,000 of you now in the last week have signed up to our new post-vaccination antibody study. We have now sufficient funds to extend that to a total of 15,000 people, so please do look out for invitations to retest your antibody status once you've completed your course of vaccination, and we'll be able to do research to find out what are the determinants of vaccine response and how well does a good antibody response after vaccination predict protection down the line. Of course, we also want to evaluate treatments, and as you know, COVIDENCE UK is a platform for clinical trials, and I'll talk a little bit more about the first of those that we've got up and running and which is due to complete shortly. So we've listened to feedback from you all about the questionnaire. I appreciate that it can take a little time, and so we've gone back to the drawing board and we've tried to streamline it as much as possible. So we're still collecting the vital information we need for the project moving forward, but hopefully if there are no major new events, health events that you've experienced in the last month, it will be clicker to click through in its new form. It's shorter. The emphasis, is, I said, has shifted slightly so that we're focusing more now on capturing the impacts as opposed to the risk factors, as that phase, investigating risk factors, as that phase of the research starts to draw to a close. We've introduced more use of branching logic, so that focuses detailed questions on specific groups so that not everybody has to answer every question. And the consequence, I hope, is that you'll find it clicker to click through, particularly if you've had no new health events to report since you last did one of our questionnaires. So another question that we often get used is how exactly is my data being used? And so what I want to do now is just explain and put a little bit of flesh on the bones about what's actually going on in COVIDENCE HQ. So the first major plank of ongoing investigation relates to the first wave of serology tests which we did, most of which were prior to the first dose of the vaccination. And this work's being led by Professor Saeed Shaheen and Dr. Mohammed Talai. They're working on the following questions, namely, what are the risk factors for getting a positive antibody test? What determines the strength of the antibody response? And what determines whether or not people get symptoms? Another major focus is on so-called long COVID. So this is people who are experiencing symptoms of COVID 4 or more weeks after they become ill. And this work's being led by Professor Gwyn Davis at the University of Swansea and Dr. Paul Pfeffer at Queen Mary and Barts Health. And there's a particular focus on how common long COVID is in non-hospitalised people. You may be aware that there's a national study going called FOSP COVID, which focuses on people who've had COVID requiring hospitalisation. But what COVIDENCE uniquely can bring to the table is information on people who had COVID in the community but didn't require hospitalisation. So they're working on the data to answer questions including how common is long COVID in people who haven't been to hospital compared to those who have? What's the natural history of it? How quickly does it get better or not? And what things can help? For example, there's now an emerging story that perhaps vaccination can improve symptoms in people who've got prolonged symptoms of COVID-19. Paul Pfeffer is also a member of the FOSP COVID consortium with Leicester University, and this allows him to work on data from COVIDENCE and combine it with data from FOSP COVID, which focuses on hospitalised patients, to ask the question, how does long COVID compare in people who had COVID in the community to those who had to be hospitalised for treatment? Another interesting angle that we're currently pursuing is collaborative work with Dr. Patrick Short at Sanogenetics, and we're hopefully going to secure funding to launch a genetic study focused on people who are having long COVID in order to answer the question of, are there any genetic risk factors that determine whether one person gets prolonged symptoms while another one seems to recover more quickly? Another major focus of ongoing work relates to understanding the impact of the pandemic and society's response to it. So Dr. Dominic Zenner here at Queen Mary is working on the impact of the pandemic and the societal response on physical health. And Katie Young at King's College London is working on the data that you've shared with us relating to mental well-being. As I've mentioned, a major area of investigation also relates to the effects of COVID-19 vaccines, and Hayley Holt, who's done so much to really drive this study, the principal investigator on the study, is doing work to look at how common adverse effects of vaccination are and what are the risk factors for experiencing these. And in the lab, Emma Chambers and her team at the Blizzard Institute at Queen Mary in Whitechapel is working on blood spots and also venous blood samples from people who've had 2 doses of vaccine to answer questions like how common is it for people not to have an immunological response following 2 doses of vaccine? What are the risk factors for lack of antibody and T-cell responses following vaccination? And does this matter? We're going to follow people up over months to see whether or not those who have a weaker response after vaccination do indeed seem to be more susceptible to COVID-19, or maybe not. Finally, no talk would be complete without a mention of vitamin D, and David Joliffe in the team, as you will know, is running the CoronaVit trial. It's the world's largest trial of vitamin D for the prevention of COVID-19, with some 6,200 participants nested within the COVIDENCE UK study. And this trial will, I hope, provide a definitive answer to the question of whether or not vitamin D can reduce risk or severity of COVID-19. And then subsequently, as the months pass, we'll be able to then do a secondary research to work out whether or not vitamin D might enhance response to vaccination, as we recently showed to be the case for vaccination against varicella zoster virus, another viral pathogen. So in addition to all the use that we are making of your data, we are also contributing to national initiatives funded by the UK government, whereby anonymised data from COVIDENCE UK is put onto secure research platforms such as the Breathe Data Research Hub, and this data can then be made available in anonymised form to other researchers who are looking, for example, at long COVID post-hospitalisation in the FOSP-COVID study, or who are looking at determinants of antibody response in the CoConnect study. So these are national and international collaborations, and our contribution of data to those really maximises the value of the data that you've shared with us. So what's the bottom line here? I think I would like to just make 3 points. First of all, I think it's fair to say that we've come a long way in the last year. It's also fair to say that we have pretty ambitious plans for the year ahead. But the main message I want to leave you with is just to highlight that none of this would have been possible without the commitment and the time that you've invested in answering our questionnaires and responding to all the sub-studies that we've invited you to take part in. So my final message to you this evening is just to say thank you all very much for all your contributions over the first year of the study, and I look forward to working together with you in the year ahead.